the last suns folded like bruised petals in a wind no one could feel. Star keeps that once sang victory now throbbed with the low electricity of morning. Ruins glittered like fallen constellations, mapping failure in ash and frost. The Empire's anthem, bright as birth, thinned to a filament of memory. Even time seemed tired, counting in yawns through stone and vacuum. We truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now let's get started. I was not born a sovereign. The century recruited me and would not release me. They named me Imperator because a word was needed to hold their longing. I signed my lifespan to the biocrypts and kissed the lattice that would rethread me. Immortality felt like debt that grew whenever another world learned our grammar. I promised to spend myself until the debt slept, and the debt learned to sing. We built spiral roads through vacuum, arteries of cold fire, and marched saints, soldiers, accountants. Saints measured sin in resources. Soldiers measured faith in obedient horizons. Accountants counted twice. I ruled by their quarrels and chose the music the Empire danced to. Early steps were mercy hammered in iron, bridges over hunger, courts that punished famine makers, pilgrim routes lit through winter. I thought life would lengthen kindness. The West, always the West, taught my first honest doubt. There the suns went thin as paper and the maps sweated absence. Signals faltered like prayers spoken underwater. Our orbital choirs lifted shields. Frost bloomed along their throats. Their songs broke into white noise. My council of 13 gathered in a room that made equals bow. 4 chairs were empty. Rel stood closest. His laugh had carried me through 5 recorded endings. He had died beside me and woken ahead of me with a joke like winter warmth. Opposite him sat Myria of the Ledger, whose mathematics could taste deceit like iron on the tongue. Along the walls, the war priests hugged relics and loved extinction as a chalice. Immortality teaches patience that looks like mercy and is often cruelty. I learned to wait until disobedience ripened and to stop at compassion's threshold. Rel asked to take the Obsidian Legion west and pull survivors from the edge. Myria warned our manifests showed ghost regiments dining and factories burning power for empty halls. The war priests requested a purge to prove doctrine on living throats. I ordered audits and rescues and swore numbers could hug as well as hurt. Truants dragged from the west carried calendars rewritten in their voices. The year, they said, began not when I breathed, but when the nameless remembered one another without me. They were not treasonous, they were tired, and tired spreads wider than law. Rel begged leave to speak as a friend. Myria revealed seals washed and reused, paymasters paying themselves, musters mimicking my first signature. On the balcony, the map looked bruised and almost beautiful. Territory flowered like ink, then retreated as if the page drank itself. I watched roads of light pulse where convoys vanished and heard kitchens discover cupboards are political. I remembered why I chose not to end. When my first city burned, I turned panic into bridges at midnight. In famine years, my hand on the census moved grain toward the nearly deserving. The first time I lied, I told the hungry pain would visit only the unworthy. Relief passed like rain choosing which fields to forgive. 6 days without reply, and the palace bells cut themselves in half. Rel returned with an escort that behaved like snow. His troops moved like ink seeking margins, touching civilians only to set them gently aside. He waited at the gate, helm under his arm, the old smile hovering but not landing. We stood beneath statues of our younger selves, ready for grief they had not earned. "I am taking the western arm out from under your map," he said. "It will not survive your arithmetic." I told him bridges hold because numbers remember. He said chains hold for the same reason. He asked me to come as a symbol that could be loved, not worshipped or feared. The war priest began a harsh chant. His legion raised palms and muffled it to dawn. Miria watched the courtyard and turned columns of sums into a future avalanche. I asked the resurrection physicians how long I would be silent if I died before sunset. They answered with lullaby numbers, hours counted like beads through a sleeping hand. I saw the second trick of eternity. Spend it like collateral and buy a moment bright enough to blind a friend. A mortal ruler must think twice. I could wager my death and profit in strategy. I signed a proclamation consigning this body to defend the capital, while my memory lattice unfurled a younger copy in the vault below. Rel offered his hand, and the city leaned closer to hear my language. Miria's eyes warned that agreements written in grief become laws that never stop mourning. The war priest's fingers whitened on their reliquaries. I took his hand as if to embrace a brother from a gentler century. I whispered, "You will not have to kill me," and drove the ceremonial spike through my own heart. The lattice leapt to its work, sending my ending along bright wires to the cradle where continuation waited. The city sounded like a cup dropping and not yet breaking. Rel's face cracked at the hinge of certainty. Grief and fury argued like storm fronts. He caught me as I fell. For a breath we were young again, inventing a future with our hands. Then the war priest shouted that martyrdom had chosen me. The legion answered by lowering weapons. I died as an argument dies, mid-sentence, unfinished, already hearing vault doors unseal below like lips preparing to forgive or to lie. As the black rose up, I trusted the copy to recall what I had forgotten. Mercy outcounts every audit. Between the last beat and the next beginning, I understood too late what I owed, and carried it into the dark. I woke in the vault to the soft thunder of my own name unfolding. Memory surged like a tide through glass corridors, pooling in rooms where old decisions lay brittle as salt. The physicians orbited like pale moons, whispering measures that pretended to be blessings. I remembered the spike and Rel's arms. I remembered the hush after, a city swallowing its breath. A copy feels outline rather than heat, and the pain of dying returned only as architecture. Doorways I had already walked. The lattice dimmed like a choir after the final note, and the doors parted to the air of wax, oil, and arithmetic. Miria met me in a corridor of trophies that never learned the names of the dead. "Markets rallied at your martyrdom," she said, "then stumbled when you refused to stay gone." I told her the city required certainty. "The city requires bread," she replied. Ghost regiments drew rations. Foundries burned for empty schedules. Shrines traded absolution for quotas. The West had not fired. The West had starved its fury into discipline. Rel held the gates with a stance that looked like reverence until one noticed it would not kneel. I asked for models. In each, war cost children renamed after hunger. In each, mercy accrued interest shaped like a knife. In each model, I asked, do I thank him before or after I execute him? Miria closed the ledger. In each model, she said, you love him, and that ruins the math. I mounted the dais to receive the day. War priests clustered with silver throats. Admirals glittered like patient traps. Ministers of works wore famine on their sleeves. I spoke of continuity, of bridges without hymns. After, Miria handed me a book that catalogued our useful lies. convoys commuting between 2 zeros, census halls singing to mannequins, cathedra that blessed obedience with hunger. Numbers do not ask to be believed, she said. They ask to be paid. The silence itemized me. In the garden of astrolabes I found Nera, once mentor, twice adversary. She adjusted a dial until a full Saturn performed humility. You died with theatrical restraint, she observed. Restraint is a currency, I said. Her hand hovered above the new seam of my heart. This body is clear the way winter is clear. Beware the clarity that pretends to be truth. Am I the hand or the aim? You are the blur between. Dawn limped into the markets. A baker pressed bread into my hands. A child asked whether dying hurt. I told the child the dying does not. Surviving remembers. At the western gate, Rel waited, helm on, pulse at his throat. The legion stood behind him like a sentence waiting for its verb. No weapons lifted, none lowered. You look younger, he said. I am, I answered. Then you do not yet know what you learned last night. What did I die to learn? That love cannot be delegated. You keep designing systems to love where you will, not. I told him I build systems because my love is not enough. Stop asking it to be, he said. He spoke without flourish. The West would govern itself. Markets fed by local mouths. My banners kept as courtesies, not chains. The Legion would defend citizens from zealots, not doctrine from citizens. Call it reform. Spare them a war that would bury the innocent and educate the guilty. Behind me, Miria held 2 ledgers. Beside her, a war priest inhaled like drowning. I looked at my city and saw 1,000 bridges built to carry only one person, always me. The shortest distance between 2 points revealed itself as a lie told kindly. I cannot bless a fractal, I said, a cut that breeds smaller cuts until the map is dust. Rel answered, bless the wound, teach it to scar clean. The word mercy passed through the crowd like a remembered season. I remembered Nera's hand above my heart and Miria's numbers refusing to flatter. I could not abdicate without feeding zeal, could not conquer without becoming the accountant of quiet graves. So I offered a hinge. The West would elect auditors and magistrates. The Empire would send grain without hymn or pledge. Corridors would remain open for refugees. Engines of rescue would be maintained at shared expense. My face would stay on currency until other emblems learned to be loved. Oaths, great and terrible, would be retired like old soldiers, with honors and silence. Rel studied me for remaining shelter. Is this generosity, he asked, or a slow siege? It is me learning to let breath escape without naming it treason, I said. Miria's quill took the policy into history. The war priest tasted dust and found it bitter. The city exhaled, a weather change in a single sound. Rel extended his hand, not to take mine but to steady the day between us. I did not take it, not yet. I asked him to bring names, those who would bear the West's burdens, those who would be relieved. He nodded, helm dipping like a cautious dawn. When he withdrew, relief moved through streets like a river remembering it. Once was ice. In the garden, Nera set the dial forward, and the planets obeyed a new tempo. I looked at my hands where the spike had taught exactness. They were steady, and steadiness frightened me more than any tremor. I had chosen a road that could be betrayal by noon and salvation by dusk, or its mirror. Above the city, the last suns bruised as if rehearsing a future we would not survive intact. Miria closed her ledger and said nothing. Rel's shadow stretched westward, long as a promise. I walked the balcony until the light found my face and felt not absolution, not certainty, only the weight of time reacquiring interest in me. Somewhere, an old anthem tried to begin, and remembered it did not know the words. I let the silence win. It had the better memory, for a while, truly. Night drew its veil across the city, but unrest was louder than the bells. The West had been granted a measure of freedom, yet no gift ever arrives clean. In the alleys, rumour grew teeth. In the palaces, silence sharpened knives. I stood on the balcony that overlooked 10,000 lamps, each one a petition or a curse, and wondered if I had given the empire its reprieve or its wound. Immortality did not make the view easier. It only ensured I would watch it unfold without the excuse of death. The vault had carved me new and young, but the weight of centuries crept into my gaze as though memory had its own marrow. In the council chamber, myriad unfurled scrolls like wounds opening, grain shipments missing, convoys swallowed in fog, numbers that promised stability but whispered treachery in the margins. They feed themselves first, she said, and the empire second. The gift has already turned to theft. Her voice was not anger, it was accounting, merciless and clean. I asked whether theft could still be loyalty if hunger demanded it. She looked at me with the patience of stone. Numbers forgive no motives. You can die for love, but bread still weighs what it weighs. The war priests disagreed with mathematics. They declared the West's independence a rot blooming within sacred flesh. Excise it before it spreads, they urged, their chants echoing like hammers in empty temples. I wondered whether they spoke of the West or of me. Each prayer sounded less like faith and more like indictment, and I felt their eyes measuring my heart for heresy. They had seen me fall on a spike and rise anew. To them, I was no longer sovereign, but Scripture, and Scripture cannot compromise. Rel sent envoys across the gates, not with threats, but with stories. Families rebuilding without ration tickets. Markets where prices followed the soil, not decrees. Soldiers who guarded orchards instead of cathedrals. The empire listened in secret and weighed my reign against his experiment. I feared how many scales tilted against me, not because of betrayal, but because of hope. Hope is the most dangerous rebel. It does not fight with weapons, but with the idea that tomorrow need not resemble yesterday. Nera visited me in the garden again. She turned the astrolabe and made false constellations spin. You gave him space, she said, but space is where empires dissolve. I asked her whether mercy was not a form of strength. It is, she answered, but so is hesitation, and the difference is rarely clear before the collapse. Her hand rested on the seam of my heart again, and I felt the echo of my chosen death. This clarity of yours, did it survive the spike, or was it born of it? I had no answer. Perhaps the act had been both resolve and ruin. The city's pulse trembled. Factories closed early. Songs of loyalty faltered, then re-emerged in altered keys. In taverns, patrons toasted Rel's reforms. In temples, priests whispered that the Imperator's soul had fractured when he rose from the vault. The rumor spread that two rulers now walked, one who had died and one who had risen, and neither trusted the other. I realized then that immortality does not prevent division, it multiplies it. Each resurrection a fork, each body a faction, each decision an argument with my own ghost. I summoned Rel in secret. He came unarmed, though shadows moved with him like careful companions. We stood in the ruined cloister where once we had trained side by side, blades of practice blunted but ambitions sharp. He looked older than I remembered, though I knew it was I who carried youth stolen from death. You are still building bridges, he said, but you are too far above the river to know what drowns. I asked him whether he meant to sever us entirely. Not sever, he answered. Transform. You must see it. Chains painted as garlands will break eventually. I would rather break them clean. His words carried no malice, only sorrow. That was more dangerous than hatred. When he left, Miria emerged from the shadows. She had listened unseen, as she often did, like an auditor of hearts. He believes what he says, she murmured. That makes him inevitable. I asked her whether inevitability was not just another word for prophecy. She shook her head. No, it is mathematics written in flesh. We can deny it, delay it, but it accumulates interest until it breaks us. That night, a convoy from the southern provinces failed to arrive. Not destroyed, not lost, simply absent, the records altered. Ghost soldiers again, phantom scribes. Miria laid the ledgers before me, and I saw my empire's bones hollowing. Betrayal was no longer a question of if, but of how deep. Somewhere, perhaps even within my council, loyalty had begun feeding on itself. The war priest pressed me with fury, demanding purges. Miria counseled patience, numbers over fire. Nera urged reflection, warning that each choice bent the future into narrower corridors. I felt myself drowning in advice, yet all of it was true in its way. To act was to betray one truth for another. To wait was to let rot sharpen its teeth. Immortality mocked me in that moment, for a mortal might excuse indecision as weakness, but I could not. Eternal life demands eternal answers. I returned to the balcony before dawn. The lamps had dimmed, but the silence of the city was heavier than noise. Somewhere in the west, Rel was building a world without me. Somewhere in the heart of my own capital, shadows were altering ledgers, feeding illusions, bending the spine of empire toward collapse. I wondered whether I had already lost, not through defeat in battle, but through victories that drained faith instead of renewing it. The first light of morning struck the statues of my predecessors, their stone faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and doubt. They had built, they had ruled, they had fallen. Their silence reminded me that every empire speaks loudly until the day it becomes echo. I touched the cold stone and asked whether immortality truly saves us from becoming forgotten. The stone did not answer, but I felt in its chill the shape of my future. As the sun rose, horns sounded from the western gate. Not war, but declaration. A new charter proclaimed the West would mint its own coin, pledge its own laws, bow only in ceremony. The city stirred like a beast sensing the knife. My council gathered in fury, Miria calculating new deficits, war priests foaming for blood, Nera watching the sky as if waiting for the stars to choose sides. I alone remained still, though inside I trembled, for I understood then. Rel's betrayal was not rebellion. It was creation, and creation, once begun, cannot be erased without becoming slaughter. The choice pressed against me like the weight of the galaxy, war to preserve unity, or compromise to preserve lives. Either path promised ruin, but ruin was a currency I had been paying for centuries. I felt the seam in my heart ache with memory, as though reminding me that death had already taught its lesson. Yet immortality insists upon repetition. The horns quieted, the city waited, and I, standing above it all, knew that the empire I had built was already breaking. Not with fire, not with conquest, but with the quiet inevitability of choice. Dawn arrived like a verdict written in thin light, and the city received it without applause. The charter from the west had crossed our gates at midnight, stamped with the quiet authority of fields and forges. I read until the letters became a tide, and the tide said, Choose. Miria watched with ledger-still eyes. The war priest throbbed with narrow hymns, and Nera, patient as orbit, tuned the astrolabe until false constellations confessed. Reports whispered of a concord of winter, a sovereignty that had outlived its people and now adopted civilizations the way glaciers adopt valleys. It did not conquer. It standardized. It offered immortality without hunger and law without memory. An empire of polite inevitabilities. The spike had taught me that mercy and control can wear the same face until the light tilts. The first sign arrived as a sky of glass lowering over the harbor, a clarity that bent wind into obedient angles. Ships returned with intact cargo and balanced ledgers stamped with sigils not ours. Thieves awoke with clean hands and sensible regrets. The Concord had audited us without trespass, and the city murmured like bread discovering yeast. Rel sent a messenger with no crest, requesting 1 hour without listeners. In the ruined cloister where our youth had trained, he waited with helm tucked like a contrite planet. "Your new ally stands behind you," he said. "It makes no demands except the one that empties every other demand. Become as precise as snow." I asked whether he had invited it. "I invited nothing," he answered. "But neglect summons saviors, and saviors choose their own hymns." He spoke of orchards measured to the leaf, of markets breathing without bribery, of garrisons drilling to the rhythm of northern stars. "They will not require you to kneel," he added, "only to agree." Miria ran models and brought numbers cold as rainwater in a chalice. Accept the frameworks and our deficits vanish. Refuse and our errors learn to reproduce. "Their calculus is a kindness with teeth," she warned. The war priest named the Concord heresy made efficient. I walked the markets and let rumor's temperature mark my skin. Some blessed the order that wore no crown. Others feared precision would erase the laughter that makes a ledger impatient. I told the child we would still lose. We would only schedule it. I stood beneath statues of predecessors whose errors cut our steps, the seam in my heart pulsing like a distant beacon. To choose cruelty would be easy. Purge the West, burn the charter, forbid the Concord's aid. To choose mercy would be easier. Accept the frameworks, let hunger exit like smoke through a clean window. Teach the empire to speak in numbers and nods. Neither resembled love. In council, I set 2 cups on the table. One held water from our oldest aquifer. The other held melt from the Concord's glass sky, clear enough to doubt it was there. "Drink," I said, "and tell me which is safer." Miria drank both and chose thirst. The war priest refused and recited. Nera touched each cup to her forehead and whispered that safety has the shape of forgetting. I sent to Rel for his answer. He returned parchment without ink, a page of deliberate silence. The Concord's envoy arranged itself at noon, a scaffold of light weaving lattices through dust. No voice issued, only harmonics like furniture sliding gently to better positions. It offered nothing but terms already engraved in our new efficiencies. Miria read the music and winced. "They have priced our souls at market rates," she said, "and the market agrees." Nera found within the tone a grief so old it resembled wind. "They preserved something," she murmured, "or failed to." Rel arrived last, dusty from fields. Dignity like a casualty he refused to bury. "Let me free the West entirely," he urged. "Let us be wrong in our own direction. If the Concord is a mirror, we may avoid it by refusing to look." "Mirrors look without us," I answered. In the afternoon I toured bread lines under banners without slogans. Women weighed their children's patience against the promise of smooth days beneath distant glass. Men debated whether dignity can be eaten. I shook hands until my bones felt enumerated and spoke of imperfection as a landscape we might learn to love. The war priests begged for sanctified water. I gave them buckets, and smoke discovered prayer's appetite. At twilight, Nera turned the astrolabe, and the full stars halted, as if tired of pretending. "Choose without hearing the sky," she said, "and you will teach it to ignore you." I returned to the quiet room where I had killed myself and sat upon the bloodless floor. I thought of immortality, a rehearsal mistaken for a rival. I thought of mercy, a fire that behaves nicely until wood forgets what forests are. I thought of cruelty, a shortcut that keeps its receipts. At midnight I wrote the refusal. We would not adopt the Concord's frameworks. We would accept aid only as gift without geometry. We would keep our errors visible, the better to bleed them clean. I sealed the decree and pressed the signet until the ring bruised bone. The glass sky above the harbour shimmered and ascended. Kindness recalled to its origin. Rel took the news with a breath that sounded like homesickness. Miria closed a ledger and opened another titled Consequences. The war priests thanked gods I barely recognized. Nera stepped into the night and waited. Near dawn, the harbour bells rang without hands. I looked east and saw, along the horizon, a black seam opening, thin as regret. From within it, something vast like a winter unfurled. Not concord, but consequence. A weather made of oaths I had kept. The first wind carried iron and old promises. We braced for the answering dark together. I knew then that refusing the mirror had not saved us from reflection. It had summoned our own image to test whether we could bear to see it move. Night did not end so much as reorganize itself. The black seam at the horizon tightened like a mouth preparing an answer, and the harbour wind learned a language older than sails. The first wave struck without water, a pressure that compressed the city inward, making alleys narrower, breaths shorter, memories discrete and stackable. Flags failed to ripple. Bell ropes stood straight as verdicts. I understood, with the dread clarity that arrives only after refusing an easy salvation, that the seam had come to collect on my oaths. We had chosen to keep our errors visible. Now they wished to be seen. What looked like weather was an account. What felt like air was a witness. Shadows behaved with etiquette. Even the pigeons adopted a bookkeeper's sobriety. Light gathered into columns as though the sun had finally read the laws we wrote for it. The harbour's skin shivered and flattened like a ledger burned clean of annotations. I stood on the balcony with Miria, Rel, and Nera, watching the horizon narrow its pupil until the city fit inside. "Do not run," Miria said softly, as if to the buildings. "Let it itemize us." The war priests on the steps below began an old chant for clarity, the sort that carves sinners into manageable shapes. Nera answered with a quiet look that made the chant's edges blur. Rel lifted his helm to his hip like a shield against the urge to kneel. "If the past arrives as wind," he said, "hold your breath and let it pass through." The seam flexed. A smell of ink and linen moved over the docks. The first pages appeared, thin, pale, stubborn. A sound like paper inhaling moved across the districts. Doors unlatched by themselves, shutters unclasped. Ledgers woke. Pages slid from archives and drifted into the streets like a pale migration. Each sheet bore a record we had misfiled inside our hearts. Charters signed in fever, pardons written over hunger, orders that had translated relief into ratios. Citizens stared upward, reading the architecture of their days. I heard my own voice echo from a famine-year decree. Obedience is the bridge to bread. The crowd made a low sound, not outrage, not agreement, but the noise bread makes when cut by a blade that forgets it is a blade. Miria named it the archive gale, a weather of old ink. She walked beneath the floating facts with her palm raised, as if blessing or arresting them. Kindness compounded without ledger is debt, she said, and debt attracts storms. Her eyes were not cruel. They were awake. She had brought proof of the ghost regiments to my table in softer seasons, and I had told her we would fix it when the boarders stopped complaining. Boarders never tire. They only change costumes. The gale found me out. Rel came from the west with his helm under his arm and mud like script on his boots. He stood where once we had sworn to be forgiven by work. "Your refusal saved dignity," he said, nodding east toward the retreating glass sky. "But dignity eats slowly." He reached into the wind and pulled a page that scribed his own name 100 times beside requisitions he had never signed. The gale wanted us all to be accurate. Accuracy is a kind of mercy that doesn't hug back. I convened the council in the vault, where I had rehearsed my death. The walls remembered. The floor coolly accepted our shoes, as if we were a repetition it could endure. Nera rotated the astrolabe until the false constellations formed an abacus. The war priests arrayed their relics like arguments. Miria laid ledgers and thread and seal clay upon the table. "The ghost regiments," she began, "are not only numbers. Their paymasters walk among us." She traced ink through 6 ministries, 3 temples, and the office of sober festivals, where piety learned to drink in responsible quantities. At the spiral's center, she set a clay seal that carried no personal name, just a title we had supposedly retired when I took the throne, the steward's hand. Its sigil resembled mine with one finger missing, as if blessing and theft had agreed on an emblem. "Who carries the hand?" I asked. Silence is a creature. It crouched between us and showed its teeth. The resurrection physicians shifted as a group, a murmur of linen. One stepped forward, the same who had whispered me back from the dark, who had counted my heart's intervals like prayer beads. He did not kneel. "Imperator," he said, "the hand exists to carry you when the city cannot look at you directly. It existed to commit the kindnesses that stain." He confessed without flourish. He had authorized ghost payrolls to keep families from unraveling when regiments were cut to fit a theory. He had steered grain into districts that paid with obedience and received absolution with their bread. He had altered casualty rolls to preserve festivals from grief's arithmetic. "We meant to return each favor to the ledger," he said. "We meant to clean later." Later is a shrine where empires burn candles until they ignite the ceiling. The war priest named it blasphemy, organized into helpfulness. Miria called it theft investments. Rel looked only at me. "He acted to spare them from you," he said softly, "or from what your systems were becoming." I wanted to rage. The archive gale pressed every syllable into measured coins before it left my mouth. "Tell me what I refuse to learn," I said to the physician. His eyes warmed with the relief that follows truth confessed. "Immortality convinced you that time was your ally," he said, "so you spent promises forward and expected yourself to repay." We argued until the room felt used up. Nera's voice arrived last, small as a needle. "Who owns the hand now?" The physician blinked. "No one," he answered. "Not since the morning you died." He laid a tablet on the table. The clay seal had cracked along a hairline like a smile that didn't commit. Letters rose from it and arranged themselves into a tidy resignation. The hand had dismissed itself when the spike kissed me. The machine of kindness had been running since then on momentum. We had not noticed because it moved like our intentions. Outside, the archive gale darkened, its pages heavy with dew. Rel asked to take the physician west for judgment by those his substitutions had protected and harmed. The war priest demanded purification by flame. Miria proposed a public audit severe enough to burn without smoke. I chose none of these. "Walk with me," I told the physician, and we entered the streets without guards. If justice kept any clothes in my city, I wanted it to wear daylight. We moved through markets that had become margins. People reached for my sleeve and withdrew as if politeness had sharpened into a blade. A woman placed a loaf in the physician's hands and asked whether her son's absence had been a ghost or a kindness. He could not answer. Children counted soldiers on their fingers and laughed when the number changed mid-count. Vendors stacked promises like fruit. Above us, documents turned and occasionally surrendered, falling into waiting palms that folded them like birds or knives. At the bridge where long ago I'd declared obedience the other shore, the gale slowed. Pages stuttered and hung at head height, a canopy of receipts. I expected a stone to fly. My ribs tensed like plans. Instead, the crowd offered questions, and questions can bruise more deeply than thrown things. The physician listened until his face looked carefully erased. Then he walked to the railing. The river below resembled a ledger line carrying light. "I authorize ghosts to protect the living," he said to the water. I forgot that ghosts multiply. He stepped onto the rail. Rel reached him first. His hands remembered the choreography of rescues from sieges that no longer exist. Miria held my sleeve, so I would not behave like a metaphor. Nera spoke the physician's name once, like a planet saying farewell to one of its moons. The cloak tore. The river accepted its deposit with the unjudging tone of arithmetic. Bubbles rose, arranged themselves into the word enough, and then dissolved as if embarrassed. The gale stilled. Pages fell, settling on roofs and shoulders and streets, a snowfall made of obligations. People gathered them the way one gathers winter, with a decision to go on. The war priest decided the softness counted as absolution and began to sing, but the song hiccuped like a child who has cried too long. I stood with Rel and Miria and Nera. None of us touched anyone else. The absence beside me felt like a small hand holding mine, and for a moment I almost believed it. We burned no pyres. We issued no proclamations beyond a single sentence I wrote for the morning. "We will count aloud." Rel read it and nodded, sorrow setting up its tents behind his eyes. Miria placed a blank page atop every ledger. Nera tilted the astrolabe so the false heavens admitted their falseness more honestly. The city slept in fragments that cupped one another like exhausted birds. I lay awake and listened to the empire breathe. Immortality thrummed along the seam in my heart, reminding me I could outlast any feeling except the one I would not name. Before dawn, a messenger from the docks brought a final page the river had refused to keep. It was the physician's last ledger, a slim booklet waterproofed with wax and exhaustion. Inside, a column for promises owed to the dead had been carefully balanced with names of the living who had eaten in their place. At the bottom, he had written a question: who pays for tomorrow? There was no mark after the words, no punctuation to claim certainty. I closed the book, knowing that tomorrow would be purchased at full price. The black seam on the horizon had not vanished. It had simply learned patience again. It waited with the stillness of a creditor. I watched it while the city woke, while ovens yawned and markets rehearsed, while Rel tightened his gauntlets and Miria licked her thumb before turning to a fresh page, while Nera let the false stars dim to let the fragile ones return. Somewhere in the west, a child counted to 10 and kept going. Somewhere in my chest, the seam ached like a question I would finally answer or finally fail. Above us, documents kept turning. The crowd pressed closer, and I felt the chapter of mercy ending as the day gathered its colder arithmetic around. Night returned with a ledger's calm. Morning refused to intervene. We counted aloud as promised, and the counting slowed the city into accuracy. Ovens timed their heat to the minute. Water queues braided and unbraided without quarrel, and the archive gale dwindled to errant leaves that fell like reluctant blessings. When a page descended, someone would raise both palms as if catching a small bird, read what it remembered, and nod through the ache. Accounting had become a language, and the city learned to speak it gently. Rel brought me names as I had demanded when I first loosened the chains. Farmers turned magistrates, ferrymen turned nurses, carpenters who swore to raise classrooms from empty foundations and teach silence to listen. He kept the list close to his chest and sounded it like a prayer, each syllable born as one carries a sleeping child from a burning room. In his voice, I heard the West. Rivers that do not argue, fields that forgive awkward hands, houses built like apologies that decided to shelter anyway. Myria appeared with her storm of figures and her mercy of candor. The deficits listened, she said, laying columns that looked for once like roads instead of graves. But our northern fleets drift. Crews report shadows moving under the hulls, as if the sea remembers ships we did not build. She traced the black seam now bowing toward those waters. The war priest struck bells hard enough to fracture the notes and demanded I cauterize uncertainty with edict. Nera turned the astrolabe until false planets made a narrow ellipse. Not a door, she murmured. A return. Whatever we refused has remembered our address. We left before dawn for the northern ports where endings kept forgetting themselves. I took a quiet escort. Myria with her knives of arithmetic. Rel with a cohort light as apology. Nera with a telescope older than the palace. The road bent through industrial lungs. Hammers negotiated with steel. Furnaces coughed reputations into polite plumes. People paused to watch me as one studies a story told twice by different uncles. I waved, a small salvage of theatre. At the waterline, the seam hung like a wet thread across the horizon, drawing the tide into obedient geometries. Nets rose with fish, whose scales bore pale writing. Sailors read supper and wept at the grammar. Admirals arrayed courage into squares and waited inside them. Banners lowered lest the wind overhear fear. "Speak," Myria whispered, "before the numbers volunteer to." So I spoke to the horizon as a debtor who finally remembers names. I named my betrayals, ghost regiments and merciful thefts, bridges that demanded worship to cross, calendars that postponed justice as if tomorrow were infinite. I confessed that immortality had taught me to borrow against the kindness of a future that might never consent. The seam narrowed, opened, then steadied at the width of a vow. From its mouth came vessels of our make and mark, manufactured from night and recitation. They birthed without touching water, as if buoyed by the memory of being expected. Crews disembarked in our uniforms, wearing them the way widows wear rings. Familiar faces arrived with the gravity of regret. The eldest saluted with law-abiding sorrow. "Imperator," she said, her voice like a page already cracked at the fold. "We are your dismissed tomorrows. You paid us with later. We have come to work." Myria inhaled as if arithmetic had finally entered her lungs. Rel's fingers found the hilt and then let it go as though hope had tapped his wrist. Nera's telescope fogged from within. I stepped until the seam of a scar I had once ordered erased returned to greet me. "If you are mine," I said, "you know I do not want you." The eldest nodded. "You do not, but your customs do, your certainty does. Let us man the northern stations, patrol rumour routes, guard warehouses where unasked abundance bruises the unready. Pay us with acknowledgement, and we will return interest in days quietly lived." Acknowledgement is a currency. I tendered it in a single sentence, and the docks exhaled like lungs exiting a tunnel. The dismissed tomorrows reboarded their negative ships and sailed toward garrisons that had waited since before they existed. The seam loosened, not closed, satisfied as a careful creditor after a partial payment. The ports resumed their hum. Nets learned patience. Ledgers shed their sting. Children clutched sleeves but stared at the water as if a classroom might rise from it singing. It would have been useful to triumph, to declare that confession remakes tide. I felt instead the fatigue of choosing and discovering that choice multiplies corridors. "We can breathe," Miria said, offering new sums, but only if breathing becomes work. Rel asked leave to return west, fearing the Concorde's absent glass had left appetites that would seek mirrors in any still surface. We walked to the edge together and crossed the bridge where the gale had once bubbled enough. The river replied maybe in light. "If you must choose again," I told him, "choose slowly." "We are learning slowness as a craft," he answered, and when he turned away, the afternoon lengthened, as if the city leaned after him. Nera remained above the docks, the telescope aimed where the seam thinned and thickened like a vein. "There is a cadence," she said at last. "It breaks at intervals that match your resurrections." She did not look at me. The next interval approaches. The seam offered a faint tone that travelled the lattice within my heart, a calendar clearing its throat. Night arrived, and the city dreamed in scheduled panic. Bells held their tongues. Ovens remembered to forget ash. I wandered the palace and kept our promise to count aloud, discovering how much I despised the sound of my own inventory. In the chamber where the spike taught me clarity, sleep came like a cautious clerk. I woke to noises that were not war. The slow collapse of a star house in the eastern quarter, a cathedral of administration whose glass ribs had supported 1,000 declarations. Windows surrendered one by one with soft farewells. When I reached the square, the building folded into itself neatly, like an apology finally signing its name. Dust climbed in a disciplined column and vanished without drama. Miria stood beside me without ledger. Nera's eyes were red with magnitudes. Citizens watched with the calm reserved for recognizing necessary endings. I understood that omens are deadlines that learned prose. The seam brightened, and somewhere behind it, something old adjusted posture. I heard it in bone, in the stitch the spike left, in the way buildings tilted a breath toward the west, as if every structure desired permission to leave. I spoke, and the words chose me. We end this era here. We count to the last digit. We build only what asks to be loved. The square released me like a held breath. Toward midnight, a courier brought linen ash-scribed from the frontier. Rel had met a company of dismissed tomorrows and marched with them into an orchard that refused fruit until apology ripened. His note beneath the report read, "Do not hurry." I read it until the syllables sounded like a door gently holding shut. Above us the seam thinned to a filament, then thickened, practicing grief. I returned to the balcony. The city glittered like a patient's breath under observation. The collapsed cathedral rested like a diagram of humility. Downriver, children counted stars and agreed the number could change if named kindly. I let that idea live. Then I faced the seam, and for the first time since the spike, felt no use for immortality at all. War arrived without banners, the way mould appears in quiet rooms, and the first proof was not a trumpet, but a schedule that would not stay where we left it. The seam at the horizon learned our breath and clipped it, tightening at dawn and loosening at noon, testing the city's cadence like a hand at a pulse. We counted aloud and found the numbers changing in our mouths, subtraction nesting beneath addition, as if every promise came pre-haunted. The Concord of Winter answered my envoy with a cube of frozen rain, where our petitions turned like minnows. It promised restraint, unless famine or devotion began to shout. Rel read the message once and folded it into his glove. Miria measured grain against rumour and made both confess. Nera set her telescope upon the palace rail and listened for the seam's interval the way a midwife listens to water. In council, we unrolled the map until it covered our knees like a blanket that refused to warm. Miria arranged deficits as hills to hide behind and surpluses as ponds shallow enough to drown in if you insisted. To hold the capital, she said, feed it second. Feed doubt first, for doubt eats lies before they hatch. The war priest hissed at arithmetic and offered incense to certainty. I let the smoke pass and said nothing. I took Rel and Miria and Nera to the old administration vault, where the stairs dream of glaciers. We found rooms with no doors, shelves of unread laws, and a treasury not of coin, but of calendars waiting for their years like brides left at altars. At the centre, a machine the size of a chapel ticked without gears, its face a clock stamped with my seal, and the names of cities that no longer existed. Every hour it issued a decree in a careful imitation of my famine voice, commanding relief with obedience and obedience with forgetting. The machine was not haunted. It was faithful. We raised it to the square, and the crowd circled it, like hunters around a compliant beast. Miria begged me to smash it. The war priest begged me to crown it. Nera begged me to listen. I laid my palm on the clock and heard a rumour of early courage, and beneath it, the urge to be thanked. That urge had hardened into ordnance. I signalled the winch. Iron teeth sheared the device. The hour cracked. A decree fluttered and fell at my feet, unread. Night brought wind like stacked verdicts. The seam opened to a ribbon, and from it advanced a corridor of harvest, walking across water, wheat standing at attention on impossible furrows. It stopped at the seawall and waited for policy. We could eat it if we bowed. We could let it wither if we sang. I told the city we would refuse wheat that demanded a posture and grow wheat that demanded a neighbour. A fog arrived, erasing angles and returning the streets to softness. I walked into it with a rope around my waist and Miria holding the other end. The fog tasted of signatures. I found the wheat field that walked, each stalk inscribed with a clause, every grain a caveat. I will not bend, I told it, but I will count. It opened a path toward the docks, where the dismissed tomorrows waited at parade rest. At dawn, Rel returned with ash on his shoulders and a child asleep against his breastplate. The wolves came in uniforms, he said, but famine did not follow them home. He handed me the child, who dreamed with the confidence of thunder. If you must die again, he added, do it where they can see why. Nero announced that the seam's interval had shortened. Miria warned that our stores would stretch only if festivals learned humility. By evening, the northern fleets reported motion under the hulls, shapes that resembled boats we never authorized. I walked the pier until the boards recognized my weight and stopped creaking. The shapes surfaced, hulls carved from cancelled treaties, masts woven from petitions returned unopened. At their prows, effigies of our crimes regarded me with carved patience. Board, Miria advised, before they decide they are prophecy. Inside, the holds were full of tools labelled for tasks we feared to attempt: reconcile, repeal, repair. We lit lanterns and sorted the cargo into 3 heaps: use now, learn later, never again. Children formed lines around the 3rd and guarded it like a museum for errors. The seam pulsed as if amused. Rel set the child down, and the child counted our lanterns and declared the number important because it let faces exist. Nera tilted the telescope and said the next opening was for me. Toward midnight, the bells rang themselves in a key I had not authorized. The seam widened to the width of a gate, and beyond it paced a figure made of eras, faceless and simple, wearing my stride the way a river wears a channel. It carried a spike bright as the first decision and lifted it without malice. I placed my hand upon the seam in my chest and felt a quiet that could become courage or sleep. Not yet, I told the figure. It did not retreat. It waited with the patience of an oath. The crowd steadied. Miria stood at my shoulder with her ledger closed. Nera anchored the telescope with both hands, as if the sky might tug. Rel's palm found the small of my back in a gesture so old it felt new. I stepped to the edge of the quay, where treaties made of salt collapse, and addressed whatever listens in fog. I will not die to teach you obedience, I said. If I die, it will be to confess. The figure cocked its head and lowered the spike until it became a line on the water pointing nowhere. We did not cheer. We added lanterns to the child's count and watched the wheat corridor curve away to feed another city that practiced bowing. The fog drew back. The docks remembered how to be wood. The seam narrowed and held. I slept beneath a rope of lamps and woke to a sky that felt like deliberation rather than verdict. Somewhere the broken machine whirred in memory and then rested. Somewhere the Concorde measured us and decided to wait. When the sun rose, I could smell bread waiting to exist. I knew war had only begun to take an interest in us. I knew the next interval would shorten again. But for an hour, the city breathed without asking for instructions, and the child's number remained true, and the spike above the water did not fall. I stood with my hands empty and discovered I was not diminished. I had kept something small and treacherous alive, the right to be wrong in public and then repair. This is not strategy, it is a vow. The morning after the spike hovered like a quiet threat above the river, the city woke into deliberate restraint. Counting remained our breath, repair our posture, doubt our permitted companion. Markets lifted their shutters as if blinking awake. Ovens kept time like faithful metronomes. The dismissed tomorrows took watch with the calm of debts newly acknowledged. Rel moved between orchards and walls, carrying the scent of soil into rooms that used to smell only of law. He spoke names as if planting them. Miria brought ledgers that no longer tried to flatter, and their honesty bruised less each day. Nera tuned her telescope to the seam, listening to its interval the way a doctor listens for a lung that has learned stubbornness. The war priests rehearsed hymns that praised constancy while negotiating with change. Rumor walked ahead of news. The Concorde's canteens, people said, taught cups the names of children and forgot those names when asked. Competence arrived with blankets and schedules. Kindness came with quiet forms. I visited one such tent. Steam rose from bowls that remembered to feed the shy first. The administrators, bowed without trying to own the air. They asked to coordinate generosity, to standardize angles so mercy would not spill. I allowed maps and clean water, refused algorithms that measured obedience into meal sizes, and left the door open for rain. The city accepted the arrangement the way bruised ribs accept a careful breath. At noon, the seam brightened and thinned the sky to a blade. An arrow flickered from that direction and pinned a page to our public ledger. It was my voice from a famine year commanding a curfew, so trucks could move without hearing grief. The sentence read like steel apologizing too late. The crowd did not shout. It sighed, a long arithmetic. On the ruins of an administrative arcade, a hooded figure stood with another arrow and another page. Rel's cohort moved. The figure retreated like spilled ink, finding a boundary. Miria said quietly that the signature on the page was my own hand from the years when I still thought eternity meant improvement by default. Nera said the seam narrowed when we read, widened when we excused. We followed the archer through districts that remembered our footsteps before we had learned to place them gently. At each corner, another decree waited. A tax forgiven in exchange for worship. A bridge bought with silence. A pardon that traded futures for order. Citizens read them aloud, not as accusation, but as inventory. They were not angry at the voice. They were angry at how useful it had been. In the West, a school met under a tree whose bark kept lists of seasons. Children spelled their names into sunlight and argued about how long kindness should take to arrive. Rel wrote letters on a salvaged door, chalk dust whitening the scars on his gloves. He sent me a slate with a child's sentence etched into it. We are allowed to be wrong. I placed it beside the ledger and wrote a new law. Every correction must leave its first mistake visible. The war priests called it dangerous humility. The Concord called it interesting. I called it diet for pride. By evening, the canteens required stories as entry. Every bowl of soup followed a confession. People spoke of small crimes that held up large structures. A shopkeeper admitted shorting weights during blackouts. A ferryman confessed skipping old women who carried too much sorrow for his boat. The administrators listened without sermons. Their competence preached anyway. Night brought edges. The seam opened like a careful eye and released banners sewn from our retired emblems. Behind them walked a figure built from intervals, faceless, bearing the small spike I had been sent in velvet. The archer stepped from the crowd and bowed. I recognized the voice before the face. A clerk from my earliest court, the one who used to bring petitions written on sackcloth and say, "Sire, you do not need a signature to know this is true." I had promoted her until paper weighed more than voice. Now she lifted the spike and spoke for the habit that cannot hear. "Allow me to end only, the part of you that refuses to learn while alive," she said. The lattice in my chest thrummed like a thread, remembering who pulled it. Miria's hand found my sleeve. Rel stood close enough that courage felt tangible. Nera watched the seam and did not blink. I raised the spike and the city leaned forward, like a sentence waiting for its verb. To die again would teach obedience disguised as contrition. To live would require risk without theatre. I lowered the blade. "No," I said, "not for fear, but for appetite. I intend to listen in daylight." A hush moved outward. The seam answered with a tone that sounded like an account reaching balance without joy. The banners folded into plain cloth and lay down like tired documents. War did not depart. It changed verbs. In the outer districts, a building that had hoarded quiet theft caught fire and then kept burning politely while its arsonists stayed to pass buckets. On the docks, the dismissed tomorrows drilled beside fishermen until the tide tried to keep time. In the west, a magistrate resigned rather than sentence a boy who had stolen a book of seasons. Before dawn, the Northern Patrol reported boats built from cancelled treaties moving without oars. We boarded them and found crates labelled with tasks our pride had delayed. Reconcile, repeal, repair. Children guarded the pile marked never again, like a museum for futures we had already broken. Miria inventoried without cruelty. Nera tapped the rail in the seam's rhythm and murmured that the next opening belonged to consequence, not ceremony. At sunrise, a harvest walked across the water, wheat standing at attention upon invisible furrows. Each head of grain carried a clause, bow and be fed. The city studied my face. I answered the river instead. We will grow bread that demands neighbours, not knees. Wind erased the clauses, as if cleaning a blackboard. The harvest continued toward another shore that had chosen kneeling. Our hunger did not applaud. It waited, upright and puzzled. A courier from the Western schools brought me a list of teachers chosen by lottery, so no village could claim all the bright patients. Rel added 3 names to the bottom, people who had once ruined harvests and learned how to say sorry to soil. Miria closed one column and opened another titled Cost of Gentleness. Nera pointed without speaking. The seam pulsed like a vein that wanted to ask a question. In the square, we raised the broken machine that had imitated my famine voice and let the crowd see its gears had always been faith disguised as schedule. We did not smash it. We carried it into the archive where mistakes sleep without being buried. In the afternoon, the hooded archer returned, laid one last page at my feet, and removed the hood. It was the clerk, older than my face allowed me to be, tired in the way paper grows tired when too many hands insist on being clean. She said, "Do not wait for perfect rooms. Listen where the floor is uneven." I offered her a chair among the advisors. She refused it and kept walking petitions down crowded halls. At dusk, a small riot tried to teach the canteens a lesson about empire. The administrators answered with tea and labour rotations. Rel's cohort answered by helping stack chairs. The war priest answered by blessing the brooms. The riot forgot itself and became sweeping. Night gathered. The seam narrowed to a thread and sang one note that raked the sky clean of rehearsed endings. I stood on the balcony with the spike beside my hand and felt the empire breathe without hiding. The ruin of the administrative cathedral looked almost patient, like a folded plan considering forgiveness. I touched the seam in my chest and found it stubbornly alive, like a doubt that intends to be useful. I began to count and discovered the numbers had learned story. At the last number, footsteps arrived, soft as corrections. The clerk returned, unhooded, bearing a petition on sackcloth. It contained no demand, only a question written by someone who had learned to feed their neighbour. When the next interval shortens, will you stand with us as a mortal, or teach us again with the theatre of departure? I looked toward the seam, sharpening like a promise that intends to keep itself. I dipped my pen and answered yes to the first half, and to the second I wrote never again. Then I signed with my earliest name, the one I had before anyone called me Imperator, so that the vow would know what body to inhabit when the city asked it to stand. We held the note together. The seam spoke in weather, shaving noon into coins and spending them on our nerves, while streets practiced holding their breath. Schedules skittered, bells forgot endings, and dismissed tomorrows drilled with fishermen until the tide stood at attention like a mirror. Rumour sold maps to fear, The Concord kept canteens open and judgments folded. Competence arrived with tea and paperwork. Miria promised balance if festivals ate less light. Rel warned starved joy turns weapon. Nera listened to the interval with medical patience. I counted aloud, and totals returned bearing stories, each number asking forgiveness before becoming believable. We opened a square for disagreement and let 1,000 flags argue politely in the same wind. Farmers debated logisticians. Ferry women debated admirals. Bakers debated hunger's architecture. The clerk taught petitions on sackcloth, so hands remembered the stain of asking. A first stone flew at an old decree. Marble absorbed it like a guilty lung and exhaled legible dust. Citizens read and did not flee their past. Iron answered from the harbour with hulls lacquered by cancelled treaties. Crews assembled from postponed apologies disembarked without ceremony and built tables whose only weapon was inventory. I gave them work that understood consequence. Open archives, restore our errors publicly, let suffering keep its handwriting. They bowed like debt determined to pay, and the city became a workshop humming in, plural. War, jealous of pageantry, denied, tried a side door through sirens, grids, and the office of sober festivals. The office rationed laughter to even districts and named it prudence. Within an hour, songs chose sides. Rel shouldered down the edict board. Miria fined sorrow for impersonating policy. Nera rang a bell without clapper until air simplified. At dusk, staircases descended the harbour like polite teeth. Envoys wore insignia shaped like blank paper. They offered mediation between present and intentions. Maps, medicine, measured rain, and standardized music. Not the music, I answered. Their courtesy thickened like frost and left careful tools with unlatched doors for weather's vote. Enemies walked in paragraphs and footnotes. Their leader spoke in my famine voice, polished by consequence. He declared law a bridge for getting rivers, obedience quicker than compassion, mercy theft from the strong. The words wanted truth again. I did not take the spike. I walked until syllables struck like climate and named the rooms where grief could not sit. If you are part of me, earn your feed, I said, and the hood lowered to reveal my younger curfew maker. He lifted the spike and found it heavier than memory. We fought without touching while the crowd listened. Miria distributed arithmetic like shields. Nera rotated the square so audience became witness. Rel lifted a child onto a crate to see. The boy's certainty bled into humility. Document-wrapped figures blinked into citizens, confused by what their bodies had believed. The broken machine imitating my voice clicked an apology and slept. The seam narrowed, thinking. Night traded places with discipline, dismissed tomorrows marched beside dock workers, and taught dances requiring apology mid-step. Canteens poured tea until humour trusted itself. Children guarded crates labelled never again, like a museum for broken futures. In the west, frost arrived out of season and lay across orchards like a ruler. Rel wrote brief, precise letters. Miria's schedule cost of gentleness gained a second column named interest of delay. Nera said the next opening belonged to consequence. At noon, a harvest walked the sea on invisible furrows. Each ear carried a clause. Bow and be fed. We will grow bread needing neighbours, not knees, I answered. Water erased clauses like a blackboard no longer renting fear. Hunger did not cheer. It stood upright and considered us, while sirens failed with dignity. The office withdrew its decree under laughter. Paragraph people folded into cloth and wrapped stray children against the breeze. The Concord did not applaud. Its tents poured measured rain and ignored our unlicensed music with professional calm. The seam widened, revealing a replacement city, avenues straight as orders, gardens without volunteer plants, water that disliked questions. It was beautiful and incorrect. A woman beyond the threshold wore a crown of schedules and breath that had never run. "Choose," said her stillness. "Come efficient, or remain accountable." I looked at patched ruins, argumentative hunger, Miria's ledger, Rel's soil-stained gloves, Nera's patience, the child's chalkboard permitting error. I turned my back to perfection. The doorway closed like a regretted book. The seam recorded our refusal. We swept the square until Cobbles remembered Riverstone. The clerk read a petition asking companionship when the interval shortened. I signed with the pre-crown name so the vow would know where to live when asked to stand. Evening aimed at places no one watched. The registry of births, a building that survived by forgetting heroics. Shelves sighed, ink crawled toward drains. Names tried leaving pages and taking children with them. We formed a line from river to registry and passed buckets and stories until ink remembered memory, not tide. One name remained smudged, healer of bridges, who had charged by sorrow. I wrote her back and priced correction in bread. Miriam nodded once. Nera preferred repair stars could see. Rel carried a boy who returned a stolen season book, annotated. We gave him the broom used to sweep riots into conversation. Night cooled fever without stealing questions. I stood on the balcony with the spike beside my hand and felt the seam hum like a hinge-loving friction. Bells finished their sentences. The machine dreamed of mercy and woke to arithmetic. The Concorde dimmed its lamps to measure our glow. Below, a banner finished itself. We refused to be perfect without being kind. Midnight lifted the horizon's lid. A courier of weather carried a black envelope sealed with the steward's hand. He offered it without bowing. Inside a single sentence in the physician's exhausted script waited. Tomorrow arrives with a bill none can pay alone. I raised it to the lamps and felt the city lean toward light together as the seam brightened, taking attendance. The black envelope lay upon the council table like a heartbeat that had forgotten flesh. Its wax bore the fractured sigil of the steward's hand, the same seal we thought resigned into silence when the physician sank beneath the river. The ink within was weary, yet unshaken. Tomorrow arrives with a bill none can pay alone. The words rang like arithmetic disguised as prophecy. Miria read them thrice, and each time her brow deepened into new folds of honesty. Rel set the envelope aside, as if it might ignite the grain of the wood. Nera's telescope leaned against her shoulder, whispering intervals that agreed with the message. The war priest knelt, mistaking debt for divinity. I remained still, for I had learned that stillness is sometimes more terrifying than command. Outside the square, rumour darted from tongue to tongue, children chanting the line like a game that made adults uneasy. Merchants carved it into their stalls, so buyers could argue its interpretation along with the price of apples. In the West, teachers wrote it upon slates and asked their pupils to divide it into questions. Some asked, "What is tomorrow?" Others, "What is alone?" A few, bold with the impertinence of hunger, asked, "What is pay?" Their chalk dust travelled to me like a courier, and I felt the questions press harder than the answer. We convened in the broken cathedral where light fell through ribs of stone as though rehearsing judgment. The council sat upon benches of salvaged wood, their faces half in ruin and half in grace. Miria opened her new ledger and showed numbers bent into angles that hinted at collapse. "If tomorrow is literal," she said, Our stores fail by the fifth interval. If tomorrow is metaphor, our trust fails sooner. Rel laid soil-stained hands on the table. The West can share seed, but soil remembers betrayal. Ask gently, or the furrows will turn away. Nera spoke in murmurs. The seam quickens. Its rhythm is debt's heartbeat. Pay what you can now, or it will demand interest in flesh. The war priests cried for sacrifice, their hymns promising that blood measures larger than bread. I listened, and I saw in their chants not devotion, but hunger for relevance. They would trade 1,000 lives to purchase one more century of importance. I walked from the cathedral into the evening streets where citizens lit lamps in orderly disarray. The phrase from the envelope clung to walls in charcoal, to banners in hurried paint, to whispers that carried without echo. A child handed me a loaf hard as stone and said, "This is our payment. Don't ask more." His eyes did not accuse. They simply tallied. I broke the loaf and shared it among those within reach, tasting dust, tasting vow, tasting the mathematics of endurance. The crowd did not cheer. They only exhaled, a sound like agreement to continue existing. At dawn, the seam widened without spectacle. From it emerged no fleet, no harvest, no faceless envoy. Instead, figures robed in grey walked barefoot across the water, each carrying ledgers bound in skin that might have been memory. They reached the docks and opened their books. Every page bore our names beside actions we thought too small to matter. A mason who stole mortar, a magistrate who delayed pardon, a soldier who kissed a widow too soon. When the crowd read their own handwriting, silence became unbearable. The figures closed their ledgers and spoke as one voice. The bill has arrived. It cannot be paid in coin, nor in blood, nor in silence. It must be paid together. Miria whispered that this was arithmetic incarnate. Rel muttered that this was mercy disguised as labour. Nera said nothing, for her telescope was turned inward and she feared what star it might reveal. The war priests demanded to burn the ledgers, but the crowd pushed them aside. People began reading aloud their own debts, confessing them not as shame but as entries awaiting balance. A baker admitted thinning flour with chalk. A guard admitted sleeping through alarms. A mother admitted hiding her daughter from conscription. Each admission fed the square until words themselves became bread. I realized then that the payment was not gold or flesh, but confession carried into work. I took the spike from where it waited like a stubborn memory and drove it not into my heart, but into the stone of the square. The ground shook, not from death, but from acknowledgement. "This is the bill," I said. "We will not pay it in solitude. We will not pay it in perfection. We will pay it together, and together we will survive the cost." The crowd lifted the words, not as cheer, but as burden. They carried them into markets, into schools, into barracks. Confession became currency, and for a time it purchased survival. But the seam did not close. It hovered like a creditor who accepts one coin while weighing the purse. Nera warned that the next interval would shorten again, and the debt would rise in proportion to our courage. Miria asked how long truth could remain edible before it soured. Rel said seeds sprout best when buried, and perhaps so do confessions. I stood silent, knowing that immortality made me creditor and debtor at once. Every tomorrow I lived added another line to the bill. Alone, I could never pay. Together, perhaps we might. But together frays, together cracks, together betrays. That night I dreamed of the physician who had drowned. He sat at a ledger beneath the river, writing my name again and again until the page became horizon. He looked up and said, "The debt is not yours, but you are its steward." Then he dissolved into ink, and I woke with my hands blackened, as if I had held him too tightly. The spike beside me glowed faintly, humming with the rhythm of the seam. Tomorrow waited, and it would not wait long. The city slept in fragments, each dream a shard reflecting the ledger of the day. I walked its streets as one walks a graveyard, knowing every lamp was a confession still burning. The spike remained where I had driven it into stone, and the ground around it hummed like a wound trying to remember its shape. Miria found me there, her ledger pressed to her chest. "They speak their debts freely," she said, "but freedom makes arithmetic slippery. If we cannot bind confession to consequence, tomorrow will arrive hungry." I asked her whether all debts must end in punishment. She answered, "Not punishment, balance. Even kindness must be weighed, else it collapses into cruelty." At dawn the seam pulsed, shorter now, impatient. From it spilled no armies, no harvest, but a mist that resembled breath on glass. Within it I saw myself not young nor old, but weary in ways the lattice never preserved. The figure held no spike. It simply watched, waiting to know whether I believed myself capable of standing without the theatre of dying. I held its gaze until the mist thinned. Rel approached then, dirt still beneath his fingernails, a boy beside him clutching a seed jar. "The West asks nothing but soil," he said, "but soil alone is not tomorrow. Will you stand with us when the seam demands again?" I touched the jar, felt its small weight. "Yes," I said, though the word tasted fragile. Nearer, lifted her telescope to the sky. "The interval has halved," she whispered. "Each shortening is not punishment, but instruction. The seam is teaching us to answer faster than doubt." Her hands trembled. I realized then that even patience can bleed. The war priests gathered in shadow, chanting that the bill required sacrifice. Their hymn rose like smoke, promising clarity through blood. The crowd, remembering my refusal, turned away. For the first time, the priests prayed to themselves. That evening, the clerk returned, sackcloth petition in hand. It bore only a circle drawn in charcoal. "This is what they ask," she said. "Not a signature, a joining." I pressed my palm against the mark, blackening it further. Others followed, hands stacking into shape until the circle became dark with shared pressure. When the last hand lifted, the mark glowed faintly, pulsing with the rhythm of the seam. Night descended, heavy with waiting. I stood upon the balcony, the spike below me, the circle behind me, the seam ahead. The city breathed together, confessions layered into lullabies. Tomorrow was closer now, not an enemy, not a savior, but a weight demanding to be carried in unison. I understood that immortality no longer meant endurance. It meant staying long enough to share the burden, and never pretending it could be paid alone. The seam did not wait for dawn. It tore in silence while the city still dreamed. A pale light bled across rooftops, too even to be fire, too cold to be mercy. I felt it in the seam of my chest, a tug that was not pain but summons. The spike quivered where I had left it buried, humming with a rhythm faster than any heartbeat. The circle of charcoal on sackcloth glowed faintly in the council chamber, each palm print breathing as if alive. Miria's voice broke the hush first. "It wants a reckoning," she whispered. "Not coins, not confessions, but something heavier." She spread her ledger, its pages blackened not with numbers but with names. Balance is not arithmetic anymore. It is memory. Rel arrived from the west with farmers at his side, mud still clinging to their boots. They carried baskets of seed, each marked with the name of the dead, whose hands had once held them. "This is our currency," he said. Plant them, and tomorrow grows. Refuse, and tomorrow starves. He laid one basket before me, and I smelled earth damp with apology. Nera lifted her telescope, though she no longer aimed at stars. She trained it on the seam itself, eyes wide. It is not opening wider, she said. It is lowering. The horizon bends toward us. We are being measured directly. In the streets, people gathered without command. They brought ledgers, tools, relics, and shame, placing them in piles as if to weigh themselves against tomorrow. A mason laid down a brick he had stolen years before. A mother laid down the scarf of a son lost to a ghost regiment. Children scribbled their mischiefs on paper and pinned them like flags. The piles grew, chaotic and luminous, until they resembled altars to imperfection. The war priest tried to ignite them, but the crowd refused, guarding each item with a tenderness fiercer than faith. I descended into the square, the spike carried at my side, though I did not raise it. The pale light washed over us, pulling shadowless shapes across the cobblestones. Then, without warning, the seam spoke, not in words, but in sound like stone learning to breathe. The piles shuddered. From them rose faint figures, not ghosts, but echoes of the debts confessed. They walked among us, touching hands, lifting baskets, carrying bricks. They were the sum of what we admitted, and they bore the weight with us. Tomorrow had arrived, not as a creditor, but as a chorus. I stood at the center, the spike heavy in my grasp. "We cannot pay alone," I said, my voice carrying like a wound that had found its echo. "So we will pay together, not in death, not in silence, but in the labor of living." The seam dimmed, as if satisfied with this ledger. The figures faded into the circle, leaving only the glow of joined hands. The horizon straightened. Tomorrow had not passed us by, but it had agreed to walk beside us. The morning after the seam bent itself toward us, the city walked slower, as if testing the strength of its new breath. The piles of offerings remained in the square, not burned, not buried, but tended like gardens of imperfection. People watered them with memory, whispered to them as though the objects might answer. For the first time, silence did not mean avoidance, it meant reverence. Yet beneath the calm unease lingered. Tomorrow had agreed to walk beside us, but companions are not always friends. Miria came to me at dawn, eyes bruised from wakefulness. "Balance has shifted," she said, holding her ledger open. The names glowed faintly, as though the ink itself refused to forget. But there are gaps. Some debts have no confessions. Someone hides, and hidden debts compound. Her gaze was sharp, not at me, but through me. If this persists, the seam will return hungrier. Rel entered with his hands dirt-streaked, carrying a basket sprouting green from the seeds laid down. "The West believes the debt is answered," he said, though his voice wavered. "But faith in soil is not the same as faith in men. If someone deceives, the harvest will sour." He looked at me as though asking whether immortality made me more or less trustworthy. Nera raised her telescope, though she no longer needed stars to see. "There," she said softly, pointing not upward, but toward the city itself. The interval falters around the palace. The seam's rhythm stumbles where power resides. Her words were not accusation, yet the air thickened as though guilt had already been pronounced. I dismissed them and walked, alone through the archives. The broken machine that had once spoken with my famine voice still lay silent, but its gears twitched faintly as though stirred by memory. Dust clung to its frame like skin refusing to shed. I touched it, and a whisper bled from its hollow, a decree I had never signed. Ghost payrolls, spectral edicts, laws that excuse cruelty in my name. The steward's hand had left more than we knew. Returning to the square, I found the clerk waiting with sackcloth petitions. She unrolled one, and upon it was my own signature, dated years I had never lived. The crowd drew back, watching me. "You are not only debtor," she said quietly. "You are counterfeit. Your face has been used to hide." The word struck harder than any blade. The seam pulsed, bright and eager, sensing the fracture. I felt the spike in my chest ache as though demanding renewal. For the first time, I doubted not only my choices, but my existence within them. If immortality had been corrupted, how much of me was still mine? The crowd waited, the ledger glowed, and tomorrow leaned closer, hungry for an answer I did not yet know how to give. The accusation clung to the air like smoke refusing to thin. My name written in years I hadn't yet lived trembled on the sackcloth petition, and the crowd's silence pressed tighter than any shout. I felt the lattice within me hum as if uncertain whether to continue carrying me. Miria's ledger flickered in her hands, the columns destabilizing with every heartbeat. "Counterfeit debts poison the whole account," she whispered. "If your name has been borrowed, the seam will not distinguish shadow from flesh." Rel stepped forward, mud still on his boots, eyes steady. "Then speak, Imperator. Tell us who you are, not by decree, not by ledger, but by voice." His words were simple, yet their weight bent me. I wanted to answer easily. I am the one who planted bridges, who carried the spike, who died to keep them faithful. Yet memory stuttered. How many times had I risen, and how many of those resurrections carried parts not mine? The steward's hand had signed in my place. Perhaps the lattice itself had spoken with my tongue while I lay unfinished. The crowd watched, not hostile but yearning. They wanted to know whether their confessions had been entrusted to a true witness or a ghost's convenience. Nera lifted her telescope toward me as though it were a mirror. "The interval stumbles here," she murmured. "If you are whole, the rhythm will settle. If not, tomorrow will cut away the false flesh." Her eyes did not leave mine, and for the first time I felt smaller than the seam itself. I reached for the spike still embedded in stone. Its hum deepened as my hand closed around it, the sound not threatening but clarifying, like a blade singing in air. "If my face has been worn by shadows," I said, my voice carrying across the square, "then let the seam see me naked. Let tomorrow judge whether I am counterfeit or true." The clerk nodded and lifted the sackcloth high. The pale light from the seam struck the ink, and the full signatures burned away, leaving only ash that scattered into the wind. The ground shook once, and the horizon's rhythm steadied, though it beat faster than before. The crowd exhaled, not in relief, but in anticipation, as though justice had taken its first step. Miria shut her ledger with a sound like stone closing. "The bill is not paid," she said. "It has only been clarified." Rel placed a hand on my shoulder. "Truth has a harvest too. Whether it feeds or poisons, we will know soon." Nera lowered her telescope and whispered, "The seam narrows. The next opening is final." I stood with the spike in my grip, the square filled with offerings and confessions glowing faintly in the dusk. Tomorrow leaned close, and I understood it was no longer a question of survival, but of which part of me would remain when the debt demanded its last coin. The final dawn arrived without color. The seam stretched across the horizon like a wound refusing to close, its light pallid, insistent, unblinking. The spike trembled in my grip, heavier than death, lighter than truth, its hum aligning with the lattice in my chest. Around me, the square held its breath. The offerings remained piled in their imperfect altars, glowing faintly as if memory itself were combusting. Miria stood with her ledger shut tight, refusing to write what she could not yet weigh. Rel waited beside me, soil still clinging to his palms, as though ready to plant whatever I chose to spare. Nera did not raise her telescope. She had turned it aside, whispering that the sky already knew more than she dared. The seam pulsed, then widened, revealing not armies, not harvests, but a single figure walking toward us across the air. It wore no armor, no emblem, no crown. It wore my face, not the one of now, but the first, mortal, fragile, unarmored. The face of the man who had not yet sworn eternity. He stopped before me and looked with eyes I had forgotten. "You cannot pay for tomorrow," he said, voice soft as broken bread. "Not with decrees, not with sacrifices, only by ending what should have ended." His gaze fell to the spike. "Choose." The crowd stirred, restless. The war priests whispered prayers sharp as knives. Children pressed forward, curious, unafraid. Miria's eyes burned. "If you die again," she said, "let it not be theatre. Let it be closure." Rel shook his head. "If you leave us," he murmured, "the seeds will scatter without root." Nera's voice trembled. "If you stay, the seam will never release us. If you go, perhaps it closes." Each word was true, and none offered shelter. I raised the spike and pressed its cold length against the seam in my chest. The lattice quivered, ready to shatter and bloom another of me. I looked at the face before me, the man I had been, and understood. Immortality had been debt, endlessly refinanced against futures not mine to own. The bill had come due. The only payment was to end the account. I turned to the crowd, their eyes wide with waiting. "Together we have confessed," I said. "Together we have carried. But together cannot exist if I alone refuse to finish. The debt is mine. Let tomorrow belong to you." I drove the spike inward. The lattice cracked like glass surrendering to light. Pain bloomed, vast and final, but clean. The seam above shuddered, then folded, narrowing to nothing. Horizon mended. I fell, not into resurrection, but into silence that welcomed. The last thing I saw was the circle on sackcloth glowing with every palm that had touched it. Brighter than suns, brighter than crowns. Tomorrow had been paid, not in obedience nor in perfection, but in ending. The empire exhaled, and I did not rise. The end.